BerenstEin, a short story by Michael Scanlon. Closing time at the bookmark usually reminded Thomas of the old Dickens quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." It was a bit of a private joke. As many times as he'd cited to patrons of the store how it may have been the most misused reference quote in the canon of human literature, he still took comfort in the cliché. In a life that had proven to be less than desirable, idioms served to ground Thomas to sanity more than any deeper philosophy. On this particular evening, closing time brought slightly more bad with it than good for Thomas. Yes, for a night there would be no more inane customer questions. The bookmark advertised itself as the anti-online, anti-chain bookstore, a refuge where customers could get the attention from someone who treated all books like the testaments to history they were, a place where the owner had grown up and was as much a part of the store as the frayed $2 bill from 1960 that was the first his father had received from some other customer now long gone. The truth? If Thomas's father had left his only child a bait and tackle business instead of a bookstore, Thomas would be answering inane questions about fishing. Thomas liked books, but he wasn't consumed by them like his father was. To him, it was a job. He was a little more like his mother had been that way. It paid the bills, though less efficiently than ever lately. Closing time also meant he wouldn't have to endure the indignity of pretending that he didn't know that many of the people walking his aisles had no intention of buying anything from him. They could just pick his brain, look through his selection, and then get it cheaper online. Or illegally download it for free, for that matter. Some of them even had the gall to use their phones to scan the UPC symbols on the books right in front of him. There were so many times he had to bite his lower lip to keep from admonishing them. What good would it have done anyway? But at least they were people, living, breathing, annoying as they were. Closing time also meant going upstairs to an empty apartment above the store. He had furniture, of course, but all he really needed was one chair and a bed. His twin-size mattress was 2 times bigger than necessary many more times than not. What weighed heaviest was the silence. Thomas could never shake the feeling that there was supposed to be so much more noise in his dwelling. He was just finishing up counting the receipts from the register when he heard the bell ring, signaling the door was open. A man entered, slowly, almost as if he had meant to walk into a different store. "I was just closing up," Thomas said, but not too forcibly. The man looked in his direction and then gazed around the store slowly, a slight smile forming on his lips. "I was just closing up," Thomas said, but not too forcibly. The man looked in his direction and then gazed around the store slowly, a slight smile forming on his lips. Thomas felt self-conscious about the bequeathed store's appearance. In his own mind, he liked to think that he honored his father's memory by keeping the same decor as the original 1960s fashions. The truth? He had a bit of his father's stubbornness, or was it his father's tendency to put things off? "Sorry to come in so late," the man said softly. "I lost track of the time. I could come back tomorrow." "No, it's fine. How could I help you?" The man pointed to the legal pad on the desk beside the cash register. "Is there any way you could help me remember the name of a book I used to read as a kid? Write it down for me. It was a series of books about a family of bears that wore overalls. They lived in a tree." Thomas started. "Please." The man's eyes were wide. "Just write it down." Thomas instantly felt his teeth on his lower lip. Another moocher come to window shop and then buy online. He picked up the pen and paper, the faster to get rid of the jerk. He wrote, BERNSTEIN, BEARS. He passed the paper to the man. "There you are. Anything else I can help you with?" The man's eyes raised slightly as he read the piece of paper. He sighed and then half whispered, "BerenstEin." "Yeah, if you're interested, we've got a bunch of them in the kids section," Thomas said, knowing the guy was about to make some half-hearted excuse about why he couldn't buy it right then and that he'd be back, and thanks so much. Actually, I don't think this is the correct title. Thomas stopped a moment and thought, seeing the familiar logo in his mind's eye. Then, I'm pretty sure it is. Oh well, it's The BerenstEin Bears. Just search under series name wherever you're downloading it later. The snark came from a long day at an end of his patience. No, you don't understand. You misspelled it. The man was holding the paper out for Thomas to see. You wrote Stein. It's Stain. Thomas pictured one of the books clearly in his head again. The BerenstEin Bears. No girls allowed. He'd grown up reading them in the basement of the store, along with other books that were less memorable. He shook his head. BerenstEin? I don't think so. Even as he said it, he started walking to the back of the store toward the children's aisles. The man followed, speaking quickly. It's the BerenstEin Bears. Stain. Tell me, were you able to picture the word BerenstEin in your head when I asked you before? But Thomas had already reached the right bookshelf and easily found the series. He was surprised to find the series title on top was still written in the same handwriting etched into his mind as a small boy, even though it clearly read something foreign from what his brain told him it should be. The BerenstEin Bears. Thomas took a few more titles out to make sure, but they were all spelled the same way. How odd. I didn't even notice they had changed it. That's because they didn't, Thomas. Thomas looked up quickly, for two reasons. Have we met before? The man nodded. I used to come in here all the time when I was a kid. You were a few years ahead of me in high school. You're always with that girl, Jennifer. I remember her because she was so pretty. Your dad and mom usually helped me here. Your dad was a great guy. He always let me read the comics even when I didn't buy them. My name is John. He extended his hand. Thomas took it. Good to meet you, John. There was something familiar about the man, though he wondered how he would remember a virtual stranger from over 20 years ago. The sound of Jennifer's name brought on a mild sense of regret, but one that was well calloused by now. What do you mean they didn't change it? It was BerenstEin as I remember it, or BerenstEin. You and everyone else I've ever talked to, over a certain age anyway. How many people have you talked to about this? Thomas was a bit puzzled at the name change, but even more so with the stranger. Enough. Then John seemed to steel himself. Thomas, is there any way you'd let me into the basement to look for something? The request took Thomas by surprise. What for? The basement was a maze of used books, some catalogued, some quite valuable, but also thousands of old tomes that should have been disposed of long before his parents had passed away. If I told you, you'd think I was crazy. That's why I wanted you to write the name down first, so that maybe you'd be open. To what? But John turned away. I have no right to put you out this way. I remember as a kid your dad showing me an original printing of the BerenstEin Bears book. I want to look for it. For what possible reason? I want to see if it says Beren, Stein, like I remember. I'm sure it would, if it's even downstairs. Have you looked online for images of the original cover? Like I said, they've probably just changed the name in the last 20 years. John let out a sharp bark that Thomas supposed was a laugh. Have I searched the internet? Up, down, left, right, in the looking glass, and straight through it. John was breathing heavily, and he visibly tried to slow it down. Sorry, I haven't been sleeping very much lately. Thomas thought about Jennifer for a moment, though he hadn't consciously done so in as long as he could remember, and then his mind drifted to the quiet apartment upstairs. I'll tell you what, have a cup of coffee with me, and we'll look for the book in a bit if you still want to. Fair warning, though, it's a bit messy down there. Sure, I'd really appreciate that. Let me get my research from the car. I'll be back in less than 5 minutes. What research? About the Berenstein stuff? Thomas doubted that any digging would have to go further than the first page of a Google search. Yes and no. You might as well hear the short version, so you could decide whether or not to lock the door after I leave. Oh yeah? And what's the short version? Basically that unless I'm going crazy, along with you and the 90% of the people who write down Beren, Stein, Just like you did? There's a good chance that sometime in the last 20 years, most of the people on this planet died and shifted into an alternate timeline. 10 minutes later, the two men were sitting in front of a small table in the back of the store, coffee mugs bearing the name of the bookstore, expelling the steaming aroma of a shopping warehouse clubhouse blend. So you didn't lock the door? Thomas laughed. I've read my share of science fiction. He waved a hand to indicate their surroundings. Asimov, Heinlein, Simmons. The key word might be fiction, but I can understand how it's easy to explain some of the weird things that happen in life away with some of the more entertaining theories out there. But this is not just a theory. You yourself wrote BerenstEin. If I came here and said, America is supposed to still be under English rule, I'd understand outright skepticism. But you own a bookstore, and you still wrote BerenstEin. I think that's the reason you didn't lock the door on me. I think the reason I didn't lock the door is because I'm not a jerk, and I don't mind the company, to be honest. I also think the reason I didn't notice the BerenstEin name all these years is that I just didn't look closely. Probably a couple of loud children were around when people were buying the books. Or maybe I'm right and they just changed it recently. John indicated a large accordion folder he had brought in from the car. I have the Google search results in here, but why don't you do it for yourself? He nodded at the laptop that was on the small table. Okay, I'll indulge. Thomas opened his browser and typed into the search bar. When did the BerenstEin Bears become the BerenstEin Bears? He hit enter, and immediately his eyes saw the first few results. He chuckled. Well, at least you're not alone. The first few results were sites and blogs dedicated to the idea that the BerenstEin Bears were proof that the Earth was now in an alternate reality that was able to be perceived by millions of people living on it. Then there were a couple of YouTube videos relating to the same topic. Let's see how many pages of results I have to get through until we get an answer. You search page 2 and then page 3. By the bottom of page 2, there were no sites talking about the name change. Let's try it a different way. You're wasting your time. I've tried every search possible. BerenstEin, 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 name change BerenstEin, name change BerenstEin, and 100 other unique search strings. There is no indication on the web officially that it was ever anything other than the BerenstEin Bears. Officially? Type BerenstEin into eBay. Thomas opened a new tab and did as suggested. Okay, the picture of the first few books clearly say BerenstEin. And the product description say, John prompted. BerenstEin, BerenstEin, the BerenstEin Bears. All the way down the page, 15. Thomas clicked to the next page. Here's one BerenstEin. But all the others are BerenstEin. Hundreds, John exclaimed triumphantly. Hundreds of listings, where the picture of the book clearly says BerenstEin, yet the memory is so ingrained and real in the listing seller's mind that in each case they wrote the wrong, for this reality, spelling, even though they had the book right in front of their faces. Thomas noticed that John was breathing heavily again as he talked. He admitted to himself that it was an interesting anomaly. He closed his eyes and imagined the familiar logo of the children's book. He could see it clearly, the BerenstEin Bears. I'll admit it's interesting. I can't explain it, but there is probably a logical explanation for it. Name one, John challenged. Thomas took a sip of the now cooling coffee. Okay, these are books we read as children, or more often than not had read to us, right? John nodded his agreement. So, as kids, are we really paying attention to how the long last name of these bears are spelled? Come on, you have to do better than that, John countered. That might explain how people might spell it wrong years later, but spell it wrong in the exact same way? Well, look at the name as it is on these books. Thomas took on the air of a lecturer. The BerenstEin Bears. TheBerensteinBears. The only part of the entire phrase that doesn't have an E is the part that you say everyone keeps getting wrong. But that doesn't explain why, John started. But we were all little kids when we were exposed to these books. Maybe we took one look at the title, saw all those E's, and our little minds just filled in the rest with E's. I doubt we were sounding out the name at 3 or 4 years old. We didn't read it that way. We just thought we did. And that memory of the word as we perceived it just stuck in our minds. Until we noticed the real spelling, or in my case had it pointed out to me by you. Thomas waited for what he figured would be a rebuttal. He was enjoying the discourse. John countered. Do you remember your parents or your teachers or whoever was reading the book to you saying BerenstEin? Stain is a distinct sound. It's the kind of thing little kids would laugh and make little jokes about. Most people clearly remember the sound Steen or Stein. Both would be how BerenstEin might be pronounced, not BerenstEin. Thomas smiled. That's a fair argument. You're right. I'll admit even now the correct pronunciation, BerenstEin, sounds downright foreign. The thing is, we're talking about for us, 25, 30 years ago? I can't remember what I ate for breakfast last week, so my mind probably remembers the way I thought it was spelled. And that's just the way I now remember hearing it in my head. He shook his head. That's the problem when we try to talk about the past. You and I may have a different memory of this conversation next month. You might swear that I had the blue mug and you the red, when I clearly remember the opposite. John picked up the red mug that was right in front of him. The Mandela effect. What is the Mandela effect? Now it was John's turn to lecture. Your example with the mugs was a good one to explain little discrepancies in how different people remember little details. Siblings years later remember sitting on opposite sides of a car during a road trip, for example. 20 years later, elementary school classmates will remember classroom details differently. These are always chalked up to the passage of time, and besides, since there are so few people involved, no one ever thinks of these anomalies as anything other than misremembered minutiae. Since the explosion of the internet, though, our ability to communicate with others is so radically different than just 20 years ago. It's almost an evolutionary change. So when events have happened that people remember differently later on, it's much easier to find others who remember them the same way. And one of these events that people remember differently is the death of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela? He died relatively recently, right? I remember the guy who crashed the funeral and was pretending to be a sign language interpreter during President Obama's speech. Thomas laughed at the memory of the man gesticulating on stage. What if I told you that about 15% of people who are old enough to remember would swear that they had a clear memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison sometime during the 1980s? Well, that's preposterous. To you, that may be. To me, if I'm being honest, I don't remember Mandela dying during the 1980s. But why do so many people have a clear memory of it? There are people who remember the news accounts and teachers talking about it the next day. Thomas searched his memory for a name. Steve Biko. He was another South American activist who died in the late 1970s in prison. Whenever we studied apartheid, I'm sure one man's name never came up without the other. We're talking about memories from so long ago. Maybe, John conceded. Or maybe we really are living in just one timeline out of an infinity of others that exist alongside each other. Thomas didn't speak for a moment. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so engaged in a conversation. He didn't have many friends, and those he did occasionally hang out with were always talking about their children and complaining about their jobs. I am open to the idea that there are multiple timelines. Quantum physics, which I'm no expert in, I think has a theory that every time in any reality there is more than one action that can be taken. An alternate reality or timeline exists so that every quantum possibility occurs. That is at least my understanding of what I read in science fiction stories. He chose his next words carefully. But even if there was one reality where the name was BerenstEin, and another where the name was BerenstEin, and another where it's the Smiths Bears, How could anyone have a memory of the one in the reality that they do not exist in? Quantum suicide. John let the phrase hang in the air. Quantum suicide? Have you ever heard of the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment? Thomas shrugged. It sounds familiar. I know I've seen it in sci-fi. Well, I'll give you the short version. There is a theory in quantum physics that atoms and other particles exist in what are called superpositions, that they exist in multiple states corresponding to different outcomes until they interact with the world or are observed. Then they collapse into a single state. Do you follow? Not really, but sort of. Alright, imagine an atom as a bullet. It can be fired or not fired, and it can hit its target or not hit its target. Well, until the decision is made to either fire the bullet or not, or the atom, there exists at least three possibilities. One, that the bullet remains in the chamber of the gun. Two, that the bullet was fired and has hit its target. And three, that the bullet was fired and missed the target? Thomas finished. I get that. What I also get from what you're saying is that in the theory, that if there are infinite amount of universes or realities, all three of these possibilities actually happen? Right. So in the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, the idea is that if you locked a cat in a box with a poison gas pill that had a 50% chance of releasing the gas, then the cat would be both dead and alive? Thomas answered. Yes, until the box was open and the results, cat dead or cat alive, were observed, the cat would exist in both states. Once the box was opened, in theory, both states would collapse into one, and to the observer, it would seem as if there was only ever one state. You'd either have a cat that was alive, or you'd have a dead cat. Thomas laughed. I was about to say makes sense, but I think it's giving me a headache. John nodded. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. Drink some more coffee, because I'm about to take you even further down the rabbit hole with me. So if only one reality exists, then that cat is either dead or it's alive, right? According to what I understand about all of this, yes. Well, infinity is a pretty big number. So what if you're the cat? Thomas thought he could see where this was leading. If you're the cat, you can't observe your own death. So the only reality you could be aware of is the one where the poison pill didn't release its gas. John wheezed a bit on the last word. So quantum suicide is... John took a deep breath and seemed to catch it finally. So in quantum suicide, you replace the cat with a human, and replace the box with something that may or may not kill the human. Let's say a grenade. If the human pulls the pin, what are the possible outcomes? I can only think of one. The human dies. John shook his head. Not probable. Possible. All right, I'll play along, Thomas said. 1, the guy splatters and dies. And 2, the grenade misfires, or never had any gunpowder inside it. He lives. John nodded. Well, actually, you listed 3 possible outcomes, but let's just focus on the 2. Up until the moment he pulls the pin, he exists in at least 2 different states, dead and alive. If there is only one reality, one of those states collapses into the other, and he lives or dies. If more than one reality or timeline exists, in one he lives, and in another he dies. The concept clicked in Thomas's head now. So since the guy can't observe his own death, if more than one timeline exists, the guy would only be aware of the grenade not going off. Yes, as improbable as it is, if the guy pulled the pin on 100 grenades in a row, even with the possibility, no matter how slight, of going off or not going off, if multiple universes exist, then as far as the guy would ever know, every one of the grenades would have been a dud. And if he did it in front of someone, that observer would exist in both branching timelines. One where the guy dies, and the other where the guy lives. John let it sink in. Thomas finished his now second cup of coffee. Fascinating. I have one question, though. Shoot. What does any of this have to do with BerenstEin or Stein bears? John sighed. Well, you've entertained everything I've had to say so far. Do you think any of it's possible? Thomas struggled to find his words. Possible? Anything is possible. If one reality could exist, I can't see why more than one or even infinite realities might exist. The thing is, there is no proof. I guess you're going to tell me the BerenstEin name change is the proof? John shook his head. No, not the proof. Maybe the wake-up call or some kind of signal. To who? From who? I'm not following, Thomas said. It's my theory that sometime in the last 20 years, and more likely since the year 2000, we underwent some sort of cataclysmic event in which most or all people on Earth died, sending us into an alternate reality where it didn't happen. I think the BerenstEin name change is some sort of message to try to get us to realize this. Thomas paused a moment, but not for too long. He didn't want John to think he thought he was crazy. That's quite a lot to wrap my mind around. Do you think it's possible that the cat exists in a reality where it is dead and in another where it is alive? John asked. Possible? Yes, Thomas answered honestly. So, what I'm suggesting is no different. The scale is bigger, but the concept is the same. John put a hand up to stop Thomas from responding. Think about it. If you wanted to get a message across to as many people as possible, where would you put it? What better place than in a collected childhood memories of millions of people? John, if someone wanted to send a message to the world, a person or future humans or alien beings that had the ability to change a letter in a last name in between two different timelines, wouldn't this person or beings have an easier way to get the message across than to use something that could so easily be dismissed? Thomas tried to couch his words. He had been enjoying the discourse, but he was starting to feel as if he was feeding him what may be delusional thoughts. Who knows? John's breathing was getting louder again. Maybe it's not a message. Just something to wake up our consciousness. A bell ringing meant to try to get us out of the malaise of the last decade or so. Be honest, can you possibly look at the world since 2000 and say that we are on the correct path as its civilization? I think we might be more aware of what's going on in the world today in real time, but I'd have to admit that I'm not happy with the way we're headed. The same way people have felt in their own present for at least the last 1,000 years. John opened up his stack of papers. Look, I've spent months researching possible messages in the BerenstEin name change. First I tried reading the entire series. I found no messages in them. Then I tried anagrams. There are over 350 word combinations with the letters of BerenstEin, and over 1,300 in the letters of BerenstEin. I've studied all the combinations, and there are some weird phrases. Look! He pointed at one paper. One anagram for BerenstEin is sin be enter, and one anagram for BerenstEin is inner beast. This is starting to sound like the Da Vinci Code. There's a Kodiak bear joke in there somewhere, but I'm too caffeinated to think of it. Thomas noticed that John ignored the attempt at brevity as the breathing got more audible. Thomas, you have to admit that two references to sin and beast within might mean something. It could be a warning of some kind. John, I'm sure if there are enough anagrams of my first and last name together, you could find interesting phrases. John opened his sheaf of papers to one that was heavily highlighted. Yes, you were right about that, so I modified the search to only output Latin anagrams with the two words. Each now only had 20 to 25 results. Thomas was still interested, but part of him was starting to wonder how deeply John was engulfed in this far-out theory. He'd obviously spent too much time researching it. So, with BerenstEin, here are the Latin anagrams with English translations. pointing to heavily highlighted page. There were terms like be tenor sin and be young sin, twice young we, and be ne ter sin, meaning but be we times. Now, these are the Latin anagrams for BerenstEin with English translation. He turns the page over. Instar bene, meaning well like. Ab tenor sin, meaning but the young. Instar bene, meaning be like we. Thomas made it a point to skim the pages. Some of the phrases stuck out as interesting, but he had a more pressing question. Why Latin? I tried some other languages first, but didn't turn anything up. Latin is so old and is so rooted in so many modern languages, I figured it was worth looking into. And I'm glad I did. Thomas shook his head. I'm just not seeing it. John looked legitimately surprised. Are you kidding? Even if the times, on the other side, in the beam out, we do the beam out. Be young sin, be good times, but do not be. Combine those with inner beast and sin be enter, and it practically reads like an apocalyptic poem. One warning us to get our act together. We just need to wake up, everyone, before it's too late. John looked into Thomas's eyes. Thomas could feel the need for validation emanating off of John. He was starting to worry that he would hurt John by not agreeing with him. Hey, it's getting late. Why don't we see if we could find that old BerenstEin, the BerenstEin Bears book downstairs? He saw the look of disappointment in John's eyes. John wordlessly put the sheaf of papers back in his briefcase. Sure. Hey, I realize how crazy this all sounds. They stood up, and Thomas led John to the door of the basement. Now, he said, be careful down here. I've been meaning to clean it out, but I just haven't gotten around to it. He turned the light on and gripped the wobbly banister and led the way down the creaking stairs. John had been silent, and Thomas tried to think of a way to get over the awkwardness from before. If the entire world's population slipped into a new timeline, why would some people remember the name as the BerenstEin Bears? John responded as they got to the bottom. I think that there are people alive in this timeline who never existed in the other BerenstEin timeline. As he spoke, he regained the enthusiasm that he had had before. Maybe in the other timeline they died or their parents never met, but in this timeline, such minor changes occurred to where now they exist, and have only existed in this timeline. The whole butterfly effect thing, so if all they've ever known was this alternate reality or timeline, then it would always have been the BerenstEin Bears to them. Both men had started sifting through large piles of old books. Thomas wasn't sure if they'd be able to find it, but if it had been there, it probably still was. His father never threw out a book, and he had inherited that trait. If they didn't sell it, they stored it. So, when do you think we actually shifted to this timeline? Thomas was doing his best to gain back John's trust. He didn't know why it was important that he did. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't felt a connection with a real human being in so long. He began to wonder why he had let so much time go by before searching out meaningful companionship. For everything I do know or think or feel, I'm really not sure. Maybe there was all-out nuclear war with Russia, or something started in the Middle East. Maybe the Hadron Collider created a black hole that we got sucked into, or a new Big Bang. Maybe the ancient Mayans were right and the world was fated to end in 2012. The Mayans? Did they have a constellation that looked like a bear wearing a straw hat and overalls? Thomas was relieved when John smiled. Funny. We really could never know when we died because we would never be able to observe it. The important thing is that if we allow for the possibility of alternate timelines, then we are most definitely living in one or another, or many at the same time. It seems... Thomas started but stopped when he realized the rest of his sentence might upset John. It seems what? Nah, I lost my train of thought. Thomas lied unconvincingly. Come on, we're just chewing the fat here. It seems what? John prodded. Well, whether it's true or not, it just seems like the whole theory could be used as a cop-out. How so? Okay, so imagine you have two choices. Steal from a bank or don't steal from a bank. John took the reins. So in one timeline, you make the moral choice. In another, you do the wrong thing. Thomas pointed his agreement. So, in the timeline where you make the wrong choice, you get caught, get locked up, and everyone thinks you're a criminal. But in your own mind, you absolve yourself of all responsibility. Hey, it's not my fault that I'm stuck in the timeline where the quantum possibility existed that I would break the law. I'm a good person in the other timeline. That's the real me. Where would that line of thinking end? Is there a timeline where Hitler saved all the Jews? John seemed to think a while before his answer. I'm not sure. Maybe. I'm sure there are things we all wish we had done differently. Maybe we did do them differently in another reality, but this is the one we're stuck with now. It's future timelines that I'm worried about. Thomas felt the familiar pang of regret when he thought of choices he had made in his life. Really one, Jennifer. When they were seniors, he caught her kissing another boy at the prom when she thought he had left to go to the bathroom. She claimed she was drunk and begged for his forgiveness. He'd broken up with her on the spot and thought he'd never look back, but he had looked back often. More than 20 years later, he still... So if we find it, what's your bet, BerenstEin or BerenstEin? John said, breaking Thomas out of his bitter train of thought. Well, honestly, I think it's gonna be BerenstEin like I remember, but I'm not sure. If it says BerenstEin, then we'll have a whole other question to answer. What's that? Thomas asked, not sure if he wanted to know. Who has the power to erase all evidence from the internet of the name change? And if they could do that, why would they? Thomas had an answer for that one. Well, the short answer would be just to see what they were capable of getting away with. So much of our collected and personal memories are stored online now. The ability to subtly or not so subtly change things is so much power it actually would have me rooting for alternate timelines. Be careful what you wish for. Thomas followed John's eyes to the book and saw the old hard cover. His eyes immediately went to the familiar handwriting. The BerenstEin Bears. John was holding it out for inspection. Thomas noticed that his own breathing increased as John seemed to get steadier. Thomas held the book. It looked so familiar, and yet the name looked so foreign. I guess I was wrong, was all he would say. I don't think you were. I think you remembered it perfectly. Then John opened his briefcase and took out a gun and a grenade. What are you doing? It was almost a statement in a whisper. John's breathing was softer than ever. Thomas, think of a number between 10 and 20. Though the number 12 flashed into his mind, Thomas shook his head in refusal. Please put those things away. John pulled the pin of the grenade. No! Thomas shouted and started to turn away and as quickly started to go after the grenade. When he turned, he was staring directly into the muzzle of the gun, and it stopped him cold. He backed up a few steps, afraid that if he turned and ran, he'd end up with a bullet in his back. He was in shock from the way things had turned out. Even as he ducked and covered his body with his arms, there was a part of his mind still calm enough to realize that the grenade should probably have gone off by now. He looked up. It's not a live grenade, is it? John held it out for him to see it. I assure you it is very live. I also assure you that we are very dead in whatever timeline the two of us just branched off of. You're insane. Thomas stood, wondering if the gun was as impotent as the grenade had been. John seemed to read his mind. He opened the cylinder and Thomas could clearly see. Bullets were loaded. They could be blanks, but he wasn't going to take the chance just yet. He looked at the book, which had fallen to the floor when he had started to run. Still BerenstEin's. John smiled ruefully. I wish it were as simple as that. The timelines are like branches. Once you branch off, you can't go back. Or at least that's what I thought until tonight. What you thought? You thought? And you're pulling the pin on what you say is a live grenade? What is the point of all this? Why did you come here tonight? Thomas's eyes demanded an answer. John put the gun under his own chin and pulled the trigger before Thomas could react. Thomas heard a click, but nothing else. John pointed the gun down. That may be the 2000th time I've done that. Maybe the 10,000th. It's not like I keep a count. In the timeline I just branched off of, you were probably calling an ambulance. But it's too late. Because the fact that the gun didn't go off in this timeline means that I'm already dead in the other one. You need help, John. Serious help. Let me help you. Just give me the gun. Thomas held out his hand. Instead of turning the gun over, John turned it on Thomas and started pulling the trigger. Thomas screamed as he heard the click, click, click of the trigger being pressed. By the time he looked up, he had lost track of how many times the trigger had been pressed. That was 8, plus the one I shot at myself makes 9. John kept the gun pointed at Thomas and continued. Any more and it might be the number you picked, between 10 and 20. So now it's about time I answered your question. Why did I come here tonight? Why did you come here tonight? John looked around. I loved this place when I was a kid. Reading books here helped me escape from some bad stuff that was going on at home. His voice wavered. Some really bad stuff. Your dad was one of the nicest men I've ever met, and I was so jealous of you. Me? Thomas was horrified at the thought that he'd been tracked down by a lunatic from his past that he didn't even remember. How could I not be? To me, you seem to have the perfect family, a great family business, and a perfect girlfriend. What was her name again? Jennifer. Right, Jennifer. I was just checking to see if you knew that. What is that supposed to mean? The old familiar pang of regret started to fester again, and this time it was starting to mix with a newer anger. Thomas, I love this place so much that when I decided to commit suicide, when my wife and kids died last year, I wanted to visit it one last time. But when I came here, it was a pharmacy. What? It was a pharmacy. I asked around, and then I looked you up on Facebook, and it said you were living in a different state with your wife, Jennifer, and your 3 kids. Now I know you're delusional. Please just give me the gun and we'll talk about it. You don't have to hurt me or yourself. The thought the life that John had described for him made the pang of regret threaten to overwhelm him. I'm not delusional. Like I said, I've put this gun under my chin thousands of times and pulled the trigger. Not long after I started, I noticed the BerenstEin bear name change, and other things I couldn't be sure of. The fact that so many people remembered the name as BerenstEin made me realize that at some point on this timeline, everyone must have died somehow. I wanted to find a reason why. If I can't end my life, at least I want some purpose to it. And when I pulled the trigger sitting inside my car tonight outside the pharmacy, when I opened my eyes, the pharmacy was no longer there. Your bookstore was, again. So maybe I found my purpose. You. Thomas allowed himself to think about the prom. What might have happened if he had forgiven Jennifer and worked things out? Marriage? 3 kids? No lonely rooms above a bookstore, which he appreciated but was never passionate about? Had he been too guarded to ever look her up all these years? But he knew that she, like him, had never married. He shook himself from the reverie. I can't believe that, was all he said. Well, maybe you will if the number you chose was 10, John answered as he put the gun under his chin and pulled the trigger. It wasn't 10, Thomas said. John laughed without humor. Tell that to the version of you in the timeline where I just fell dead on the floor. Whatever number you choose after I blow my brains out, I'm hoping you'll take the theory more seriously. Of course, I'll just jump into another timeline where there will be another you who doesn't believe. He pulled the trigger again. Click. It wasn't 11, Thomas said. Even if you believe that you will always jump into a new timeline every time you pull the trigger, what's your end game here? There was a strong part of him, one that he was trying not to acknowledge, that was trying to stall for time, since number 12 was up next. John put the gun down momentarily. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm going to keep pulling this trigger until I branch off into a timeline where my wife doesn't get behind the wheel after 2 drinks. Thomas gave the statement the time and weight it deserved. Then, I'm sorry that happened, but didn't you say that things from the past couldn't be changed? That's what I thought. That's why I got so wrapped in the BerenstEin name change. How could so many people have shifted from the same timeline? It took my focus off thinking I could never shift into a timeline where my wife and kids still exist. But then I saw this bookstore, and you, and your life here. Infinity. It's a pretty big number. And FYI, John said with a humorless smile, infinity is not actually a number. Thomas saw tears welling up in John's eyes. John picked up the BerenstEin Bears book from the floor. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas felt as if he was moving in slow motion as the gun came up too fast under John's chin as he pulled the trigger for the 12th time. Later, much later that night, after first the ambulance and then the coroner had left, and the police had asked many questions, Thomas sat down at his computer and started to enter letters into the search bar. BEREN. He stared at the blinking cursor for a few moments, and then erased what he had written, and started typing again. Jennifer.